All right, welcome back, everybody. This is a part two of a two-parter here. The first one, we're talking about ancient practices that help leaders ground themselves and make sure they don't get caught up in the crazy life and hurry culture that we live in, so that they can be more effective leaders. And so, last time we covered the fact that you need to have a little bit of a rebellious punk rock attitude to kind of put these into place, and we talked about solitude and silence, and then contemplation and reflection. Today, we're going to get into a conversation around two more practices, which are resting and authentic community. So, rest. How is your rest rhythm? Let's start there, Adrienne. How do you do with rest?
I'm not a good rester. I actually consider rest two different ways. So I think rest in the sense of rest where we are maybe indulging in playfulness, where we are spending leisure time. Rest is the opposite of work, maybe. But then also the actual physical rest of sleep. And so
Mm,
sleep is one of my non-negotiables. I have to
mm,
sleep. I have to sleep at least 7 hours a night. If I can't, then I just feel very foggy. I don't feel like I can be at my best. And so for me, that type of rest is really important. But during the day, I really struggle with slowing down and stopping and resting and really protecting leisure time. How was
mm.
your rest,
So
Ken?
glad you brought up. Thank you. I'm so glad you brought up sleep. I want to circle back around to that. I just made a note here to circle back around that. My rest has improved dramatically over the last few years in this journey that I've been on. And my wife was just saying the other day that, like, I would hardly sit down and just be, as we were talking about last time. And I am much better at that these days. I understand and see and not just intellectually know the value of it, but in my body, I know the value of it. And no, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Here's what I want to say is that the idea of rest, I found a lot of value in understanding the Jewish view of it. You know, when they were the history, especially when you read the Old Testament, they were a people enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and they were pulled. I mean, and as slaves, they worked 7 days a week. I don't think they worked 24/7, but they worked 7 days a week, and their identity came from what they do and how much they could produce. And when they came out of Egypt and walked through the desert and then eventually came into the quote unquote promised land, their identity had to shift. And part of the way that from a cultural standpoint was instituted was a mandatory 1 day a week, 6 days you work, 7 day, the seventh day you will rest. And that was groundbreaking at the time from a world standpoint, because nobody else was really doing that. And for us in our activity driven culture, I think is really important to understand yeah, we've got to do that. It's an act of defiance, which is part of why I wanted to start out last time by saying you got to have a punk rock attitude, because rest is an act of defiance. The author Cole Arthur Riley, author of Black Liturgy, said rest is an act of defiance. It's the audacity to face the demands of the world and proclaim, I will not be owned. And another one that I found was that if you aren't resting, you are a slave to something, uh, which was coined by Adele Calhoun. Those quotes hit me. I'm like, I don't care where you are, in your realm of belief, but it's like, yeah, if you can't rest, and I've seen it in coaching clients, they are beholden to something. They can't stop and let go. And so what is that? And in some cases, it is an addiction or a belief that they have no value if they are not working.
Yeah, and that goes back really to our first episode too about how much our identities are so intertwined with the work that we do, that we
Mm-hmm.
find our value in our work. And so if we don't rest, what are we trying to prove by continuing to work and work and work and stay in that rat race? And how is that really influencing our identities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let me ask you a question I tend to ask my coaching clients a lot, Adrienne. Put you on the spot again. I'm sure you love this. When does your day start?
5:03 a.m.
Now that's the answer, not the exact time. I love that exact time. I'm 5'10". However, that's it's not the answer I'm looking for. So in Jewish culture, at least ancient Jewish culture, when did their day start? Do you know?
I don't know.
When the sun went down. Now, why is that significant? Because they started from a place of rest. If their day started when the sun went down and they went to sleep, they started from a place of rest as
Interesting.
opposed to starting from activity. And I have found in my own life to look at my world that way is a profound shift in understanding the importance of rest. Because if I start from rest, my day starts when I go to sleep. If I'm not getting enough sleep, like you were saying, sleep's important. I agree. Did you know that before the Industrial Revolution, the average person slept about 11 hours? Now we're down under 7. And they are linking the lack of sleep to dementia and Alzheimer's very
Wow.
specifically. So our sleep is really important.
Yeah. Wow. What a great perspective shift. I'm trying to wrap my mind around that because that is really kind of shaking me a little bit. Because I always consider, as much as I prize sleep, it's something that I tack on to the end of my day. And hopefully I will be within that 7 hour range. And if I'm less than that, I get a little bit stressed out because I know I'm going to feel tired when I wake up at 5 in the morning. But to really change my mindset about, oh, I'm actually starting my day with the rest. I'm gonna have to think on that one a little bit more, Chris. Thank
Good.
you for that little wisdom nugget.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And we'll talk a little bit more about like rest. I want to touch on sleep one more time. When I this is not, they didn't pay us to do this, but I've been using this thing called a Whoop for 5 years ish. And it was I thought I was getting enough sleep. And when it tracks that, it does a lot of things really well. But what it showed me was I was not getting enough sleep. And the more I learned about how important sleep was, my goal is to get 7 hours. And recently, like this week, I realized my average was not enough. And so now I am starting my day. I'm intending to start at around 8:45 p.m., where I'm wrapping things up and I'm going upstairs to get in
Mm,
bed and get into my, sleep routine, so that I can hopefully get enough. I looked at it this morning and I got just over 7 hours. So I'm like, yes, I won.
score.
So yeah, exactly. Now, let's expand on the idea of rest. And from a religious standpoint, people would take one day a week off. And you don't have to do that. From a leadership perspective, what I'm going to challenge leaders to do is ideally you should have a 24-hour period that you have off, because like I was starting to elaborate on or allude to, is that it is an act of defiance and it is an identity forming thing. So by stepping away from the rush of who you are, it allows you the time to have some silence and solitude and contemplation and reflection, and it gives you that space, and it actually helps you to disconnect from your identity being what you do and not who you really are, and connecting to those true desires. And that's why I think it was originally instituted. And I like to say, look, if God rested on the seventh day, who am I to say I don't need that? you know
I think the other thing to keep in mind with rest too is that rest doesn't necessarily mean you're sitting on the couch watching Netflix all day,
Thank
right?
you.
There's different types of rest. And I think you have to know yourself well enough to know what is restful for you. And I think within rest is also play and leisure. And as I
Yes.
mentioned, that's something that I really am not very good at. And so by understanding how do you rest, what is going to fill your bucket? Is that active rest? Is that going for a paddle in a kayak? Is it going to hang out with friends? Is it playing with your kids? What does rest look like for you? So that way you can protect that time and be real intentional about actively engaging with it.
Ask yourself, outside of work, what brings me life? And that's what I hear you saying, Adrienne, is like those things
Absolutely.
bring you life or could bring you life. And so, like for me, um, So when I was younger, part of that punk rock skater thing, I was a rollerblader, and I got made fun of by skateboarders, but I loved it, and I recently got back into it, and that is something that gives me joy, is by going and doing that. I also love reading. I love sitting in my chair by my window, reading and contemplating. I love being with my kids, and we love watching movies, and so those are some of the things that bring me joy. So finding what brings you, some people it's gardening, it could be running, whatever it is. Rest is not doing nothing. Rest is engaging in what brings you life and joy outside of work. And another thing to consider, and this is what I love, I've studied the Sabbath, part of the Jewish Christian religion, and it's such a beautiful thing. And what they do is on Friday nights, traditionally speaking, they start with a meal, a Shabbat meal, which means stop, and they stop and you have a meal usually with community and friends, and you celebrate the good things. And some of the friends that have started this, they start talking about, it's like they have Thanksgiving every week. Like, how beautiful. I love Thanksgiving's my favorite holiday because there's not a lot. In fact, these days, we're in October right now as we're recording this, and already Christmas decorations were up at Kohl's, and I'm like, you guys totally skip over Thanksgiving, and it's just about being grateful. And so, it's like, oh, if I could have Thanksgiving every week, I would love to do that. Now, I will say my practice of resting is not as developed. It's something literally on my goal 411 worksheet that goals I'm working towards. I'm developing it. My wife and I are going to be talking a little bit more about that next weekend when we go away to Shabbat or rest, and we're going to figure out what that looks like logistically. But resting is, from a practical standpoint, I think it's more than just a vacation. It's a regular rhythm. I would encourage you to consider it weekly, either a day or a half day or time where you are literally not working, not available to work, and you're setting aside a time, ideally to put your phone away as well. Put it to bed and put it aside, and just do those things that bring you joy. If you can do that, that is what real rest is about.
Yeah, and I think too one of the hard reasons that we can't rest, I always think of the phrase "a body in motion stays in motion." That's what I experience because when I go, 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 it's really easy for me to keep momentum and just keep moving on to the next thing and the next thing. And I love crossing things off my to-do list, like, oh, got that done and got that done. But then when I finally stop and sit, it feels really uncomfortable at first. But after a couple of minutes, and then maybe after 30 minutes or so, I'm like, wow, like, why don't I do this more often? Because I feel better by doing it. The to do list is still there. I'm going to get back to it. But for me, rest is almost like I have to extract myself from my to do list. And then when I finally do it, sitting in my backyard in our hammock with a book is one of my favorite things to do. And every time I
Mm,
do it, I'm like, why don't I do this more often? I mean, I probably do it once every 2 weeks, maybe. And then I feel
mm,
so restored afterwards. It's like, why don't I do that more often? And so again, it's just
yeah.
a change in mindset. It's being intentional about it. It's making that shift. One of the things that I also love to do for rest is play board games. We have a giant collection of board games. It's ridiculous. And my youngest is 8, and she has started to get herself ready very early in the morning for school in order to preserve about 15 minutes of time for us to sit down and play a board game before she goes to the bus. And that's a little bit hard for me because in the morning I'm like, oh, but I need to get this done and get this done and get this done for the day. But that time with her is A, so precious for her. And B, it's so much more of an investment in the relationship that I just have to set that to-do list aside, and that's rest. And it's unconventional for me to rest in the morning, but I think about the fruit that is being born out of that very brief 15-minute game of sorry before she goes to school for the day.
I guarantee she'll remember that for her entire life. My mom always did that. And that's like when you're at the end of your life, like you're not going to wish you got one more thing done on your list, right? You're
Yeah.
going to wish you had spent more time doing that. And one more story, and I'd love to move on to the power of authentic community. This podcast was actually born out of a time of rest. My wife's grandfather, who recently passed away, has a cabin up in the middle of nowhere in Canada. And when I first was dating her, I went up there and I jokingly said, I'd marry you just to be able to come up here. It's just so beautiful and peaceful. And we went up there. We thought it was going to be the last time. We went up for 2 weeks, and I put my phone on airplane mode, and I didn't put it away because I was going to use it for some contemplation stuff, but it was on airplane mode the entire time. And we had set it up that if certain people needed us, they could reach my wife. And we didn't have great cell reception up there anyway. You had to kind of walk to the end of the dock on the lake and like hold your phone in a certain angle to get really great reception. But I will tell you, like when I came back into the United States is when it's a 11-hour drive, 4 to 5 of it is in Canada. And when we crossed over into the border, 20, 30 minutes before I was going to turn it back on, the anxiety I
Mm.
felt was palpable. And I'm like, that's something to recognize. And how often am I feeling that anxiety when I'm around my phone and not like, I can't rest. I noticed that when I'm like, we like to wind down in the evening watching a show, usually as a family. We love the show Family Matters. And if I have my phone within arm's reach, like if something uncomfortable happens on the show or there's like a break, I'm very tempted to reach for it. I can't rest with my phone around me. So, and I realized that when I did that, and while I was in those 2 weeks without my phone actively being a smartphone, I was like, I need to do a podcast around some of the things I've been thinking, which is where this came from. So,
So, a
all
question for
right.
you before we
Oh,
move on,
yeah,
if I may, especially thinking
please.
about our audience and leaders and entrepreneurs who have so many demands on their time that, by turning off their phone for a certain amount of time, having that anxiety almost preemptively ruin their rest time because they know what's coming when they turn on that phone, that they are going to be bombarded with
Mm,
messages and emails and texts. And so it's hard to rest because even if we are going through the motions of doing it, is there still part of our brain that's still a little bit encumbered and connected to what's going on? And so how do we
mm.
manage that? How do busy leaders negotiate that? I know that I need to rest, I know that I need to invest in myself, I'm going to put my phone away for a day, but then what is the result when they come back to it? And is that almost counterproductive to taking that rest time? What are your thoughts on that?
What a great observation. Um, what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's that kind of a problem. And it to me, it comes down to identity and boundaries, right? So if you haven't read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, absolutely read it. But he talks about when you're developing habits, if you look at what you want to do as the habit and like the outcomes, it's going to be very difficult for you to really develop that habit. Versus if you look at identity, like who do I want to be or become, that's much easier, right? When I first started working out 7 or 8 years ago, I was like, okay, I got to get to the gym, and I could easily miss it. But eventually, my identity was I never miss it. So for leaders, you've got to be very clear on who you are, which is that silent and solitude contemplation time and self-awareness, which we're going to talk about soon, comes into play. You've got to be self-aware and understand who you are and who you are not, and be able to draw boundaries around your priorities. If your family is a priority, you need to develop the ability and habit and belief that you can turn your phone off and it'll be okay. It also comes with setting expectation with people that you lead. Like, when are you available? When are you not available? I've worked in the real estate world, and it could be very difficult for real estate agents to say, here's when I'm available and here's when I'm not. But you've got to draw those boundaries. Like, at what point do you turn your phone off and say, I am not working? And I've even coached clients to be like, look, you need a separate phone for work, because if you give out your personal cell phone number and your clients have access to that, it's going to be very difficult for you to do that. And so it's a belief thing, it's an identity thing, which goes back into solitude and silence and contemplation, and then self-awareness is working on yourself and the beliefs that you have. For instance, if you're an Enneagram 2, your core motivation is to be loved and liked by being helpful. If you're not helpful and you're not, like, if you don't answer a text right away, you get palpable anxiety that, oh my gosh, these people are going to hate me and I'm not going to be helpful, therefore my self-worth is destroyed. So you've got to work on some of those inner beliefs, and it's not an easy path. And yet that's where you've got to get to a point where, okay, people have to know I'm not available. Like when I went away for those 2 weeks, I let my coaching clients know, hey, I will not be available. Right. And usually when I'm on vacation, I'm like, look, if there's an emergency, I make myself somewhat available. It's very rare that someone will reach out to me, and they're very apologetic if they do. But this time I'm like, you won't be able to reach me. Here's who you can talk to if you need something. I had a few other coaches I'm in relationship with. I pointed them towards them. Inevitably, when I got back and turned my phone on, I had 110 text messages. None of them were mission critical. None of them. None of them. So, a lot of times we think we're more important than we are, but if we set those boundaries, work on our identity and core beliefs and priorities, we'll be okay.
Yeah. Great. Great advice.
Thank you for bringing that up. All right. Power of authentic community. I want to throw this to you, Adrienne. You had mentioned your board of personal advisors, and I think, like, you know, authentic community plays a critical role for leaders, and I would just love to hear some of your thoughts on the role that it plays, whether somebody has it, if they don't have it, what are the costs of that, and especially because you have some experience with having a personal board of advisors.
Yeah, community has been really always been very important to me. And when we left our church back in 2019, one of my biggest fears was that I wasn't going to have a community anymore. And so, being an adult in my mid 30s at that point, when people have busy lives and children, it's hard to cultivate those relationships when you're not in a setting like a church or a club or a group or some type. So I really prioritized the close relationships that I had at that point, and really kind of identified who are the people that I want to invest in and invest my time in. And so those community relations started to grow. I found community, I built community in my personal life without going to a church. And then at work, so we left our church in January of 2019, and then I was promoted to director to lead our department in July of 2019. And it can be lonely at the top. And I wasn't necessarily at the top, but it can be lonely in middle management. And so at that point, I had to be, again, really intentional about continuing to grow the relationships that I had in my work environment, to identify people who would serve sort of as a mentor role for me, knowing who are the people that I can go to when I am struggling with a problem, when I'm having a bad day, when I need some advice. And I don't think I've ever told any of those people, like, hey, you sit on my personal board of directors, but they play such an important role in my life. They probably know who they are because they are my go to people. And so, in leadership, you really have to identify those people who are going to support you. And they can play different roles. If you need encouragement, you go to one person. If you need some blunt advice, you go to another person. You need someone to say, girl, just let it go. You know who to go to for that. And so whether you're
Mm.
in a church, whether you have a different type of community, I think as adults, it's so important to invest in those relationships. And it can be lonely if you don't have those. And so if there are people who are thinking, well, I would like those relationships, but I don't have them, how do I get them? That's one thing that we can talk about. And Chris, I wonder if you have any thoughts or advice about that. But for me, I recognize the people who we have good chemistry with. Maybe they're parents of friends of your kids' friends that you haven't met. Maybe they are in different environments that you hadn't really necessarily considered you could make a good connection. But figure out, how do you best build relationships, whether that's one-on-one, whether that is through texting, whether that is through inviting someone to coffee. How do you build relationships best, and really lean into that and spend time with that person to develop that relationship and start to build some of that community. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I, so my thought is that you need people that you can be authentic and real with. You have to. And sometimes, especially if you're a leader, that is not your subordinates or people you necessarily lead.
In
And
fact,
I
it
think
probably
I,
shouldn't be.
right, I've made the mistake where they were. And I don't think that's a fair thing to put on people. You should be able to have authentic relationships, but I think as a leader, you need to have a sounding board outside of that, where you can, like, let it fly if you have to, and that you can be completely vulnerable and authentic with. And sometimes that cannot be the people that you work with, or your leader or whatever. And so to find those, I was super fortunate over the last 5 to 7 years. I've had a group of people from the organization I've been a part of that are from different parts of the country, that we come together twice a year, in person, and we have a Slack channel that we talk all the time, and once a month we get on Zoom and support each other. And I'll be like, the 2 years that I went through previous to this, that were the hardest in my life, if I didn't have them, I don't know what I would have done. I literally don't know what I could not have survived it. And that authentic community where I could just, I don't I don't cry that often, but I was able to be real with them and be vulnerable and cry, and just unload with them. And they loved me through it no matter what. And they were a safe place for me, which these days you've got to be intentional about building a safe community and safe place where you can be authentic. Otherwise, uh, you're headed for a really, really difficult time. Don't just assume that somebody is necessarily safe. Like, we've been together for a long time, and there's a process we went through to make sure that, like, it's somewhat intentional, to know that we could trust each other, and that we wouldn't just gossip behind each other's backs and like share things inappropriately out there and whatnot. And so that has been really important to me. And I would suggest to leaders, you need to find those folks however you find it. And sometimes it could be, an organization outside of your company that you work with or work for, but find it, because to be transparent, that's a weight you can't carry forever on your own. You've got to be able to share what's going on. And the work we do as human beings, which again, I keep saying we're going to get to, about self-awareness, that work is not easy, and it is not quick. And you need other people to give you perspective. And, if you're in a partnership or, a romantic relationship, sometimes it's not even them. You need some relationships appropriately outside of all of that. And so you've got to have that community.
Yeah, I love that. And even what you said about the common interests, how you were with this group, or you were all kind of from the same background, even if it's not a community necessarily related to your work. What about your hobbies? Find a club or a league or something where you feel like you belong and that you have things in common with people, because that will also build community too.
Yeah. Yeah, and if it's a group of like other leaders, in addition to, like, it could be clubs, it could be leaders that are in similar stages of life, or types of work. As long as it's safe and you can share things there, that's what's really important. So the power of authentic community cannot be understated, because we've got to have that. We are made to be in community. So. All right, so we're at time here. I want to wrap this up, and today we covered. This wraps up a two-part where we talked about four ancient practices, starting with the idea of solitude and silence, and then contemplation and reflection. Please go back and listen to that if you didn't. Today we talked about rest and authentic community, and we just want to encourage you to start to develop those activities and those practices, if you will. Try them out and try them on, and give it some time, because the first go around it may not feel comfortable. Most likely it won't, but give it time, and trust me when I say you'll thank me for it when you give it some time. What do we want our challenge to be? You're
How
good
about
at
we
those
just
things,
ask
so.
them to reflect on what does rest look like for them?
Mm. Yes. And could we say, yeah, maybe take an action step towards getting some rest?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't you go ahead and do that? So.
So, our challenge for this episode, as we talk about rest, is to consider what does rest look like for you, because it looks different for everyone, whether it's that active rest or that passive rest, whether it's playful, whether it's family time. You figure out what does rest look like for you, and then also to take an action step to engage in that. Carve out a little bit of time. Again, it doesn't have to be a lot. It could be an hour, it could be half a day, it could be a full day, and just do your rest. Just rest.
Thank you, Adrienne. All right, y'all. Great to have this conversation. Until next time.
Bye.